Okay, I think this is an interesting thing as well, and it's kind of positive. So the other day, Kamala Harris was giving a speech, and in the speech, she was talking about she's often trying to draw a comparison between herself and Trump and show that, listen, we're not the same. This is what he thinks. This is what I think. This is how he acts. This is how I act. This is how he behaves. This is how I behave. This is what he wants. This is what I want. So she's often sort of comparing herself to him, showing that the two are very, very dissimilar. So when I say comparison, I mean it's dissimilar. She's showing that there's not a lot of overlap here. Anyway, she talked about how Donald Trump wants to lock up all of his political opponents, right? He said, he's talking about the radical left, and we should be willing to use even the military on them. And when he was asked to, you don't mean American citizens? He's like, yes, I do mean American citizens. I mean, I think he mentions Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff by name. But he also, he talked about protesters. He's talking about the radical left, right? Those crazy radical lefts. Got to send the military after those folks. Anyway, she says, he wants to send the military out after his political opponents, those people who oppose him. I want to invite them to the table. Now, I don't know how deeply ingrained in her policy this is, but something about her that I have heard is that I think she's committed to bringing Republicans onto her cabinet. So she becomes president, and she will have a secretary for this and a secretary for that and a secretary for this place and a secretary for that. These secretaries lead these particular divisions of the government, these organizations within the government, sometimes multiple. But she's talking about bringing on Republicans, bringing in Republican voices to represent their constituency as members of her cabinet, as secretaries within her government, as leaders within her government. That's an amazing thing, right? When I was a kid growing up in New Brunswick, I remember, and to this day, this politician, I can't remember his name. I think it was Richard something, but I remember his attitude, and his attitude was so perfect. So when I grew up, we had a guy. His name was he was a conservative. Gosh, I can't remember his name either, but he was in power forever and ever and ever. And then another fella, he was actually from my hometown, Frank McKenna, was elected, and he won like a huge majority. Now the next election came along. Actually, Frank McKenna swept. He had every seat. Next election came along. He lost a few seats, and one of the guys that got into power was a former school teacher and principal of a school. I think he was the principal of my cousin's school growing up, actually, in Moncton. And I remember when he got in, he was the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. Oh, and that first premier's name was Richard Hatfield. Anyway, this guy get in. He was a member of and leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. He was the official opposition in New Brunswick during Frank McKenna's time as premier. And there were times when Frank McKenna's government would come up with an idea, and he would say, "Yes, I support that wholly." He was on board with it. It's the right thing for the province, and I'm on board with it. Party came second to the welfare of the province. Party came second to the welfare of the people of New Brunswick. And I think where Kamala Harris says, I'm going to bring Republicans into my government, I think, to me, what she's saying is, I want the best for my people. I want the best for America. I want the best for the country. I want the best for our citizens. I want to bring in the best people. And I want voices who will represent people in a different way than my voice will, or the voice of many of my supporters might. I think it's an incredibly amazing thing to be willing to do. Whereas Donald Trump wants to have them arrested and have sick the U.S. Army on them. No. She wants to bring them to the table. See, at the table, that's where we build community, right? Like, do you ever hear that expression? You don't build a wall, you build a longer table. Because at a table is where you build community. A table is where people come together. A table is where people gather. It's not about coming to an agreement. The table isn't where you make sure that everybody's in step and everybody's in agreement. It's not a place where everybody gets in line. No, the table's about building community. It's not a place where everybody comes to agree on absolutely everything. No, it's a place where we break bread and where we build community. It's a place where we speak to one another, and it's a place where we listen. It's a place where we build community. A table helps us when we gather people of all different ideals, all different moralities, all different ethics, all different political leanings. A table, and we bring them all into that table. We are all together. We might not agree, and probably we won't agree. We may disagree quite vehemently. We may have values that simply do not mix together. That they're on the opposing sides of this of our reality. They just cannot go hand in hand with one another. But you bring them to the table because that's where we share them. And when we share them, that's when they have power. And when our ideals and our values are expressed and offered to the people around us, again, it's not to say that, hey, I agree with you, right? It's not to say that, hey, I'm with you. I'm completely on board. I've changed my mind completely, though that can happen. That's not necessarily what happens when we all sit down together and gather. Sometimes what happens is, and I say this merely, somewhat tongue-in-cheek actually, but it is a very important part. Sometimes I may share with you a value that you are absolutely opposed to, that you cannot hold. But because I've shared it, you at least understand how important it is to me. And you understand how important it is to the people like me. Again, it's not to say that you'll get on board, but you'll be able to empathize. And you'll be able to understand where I'm coming from. You may be able to understand why I hold this value. And you will understand that there are people in the world who think differently than you. And that's a really, really, really important thing. I mean, I know some presidents in the past, I'm not going to mention his name again, the fellow that likes a lot of bronzer. We know that he did not like voices of derision. He did not like voices that spoke up and said no. He did not like when others had values and ideals that were outside of his own. Which means you only get sort of you get a very, very narrow perspective, a very narrow way. When you bring others to the table, it opens the way up. It widens the path we're walking. It offers, just so many more possibilities. And again, in the end, the sharing of those values, even though we may not adopt them as our own, the sharing of those values goes such a long way. Jesus ate with Pharisees. Jesus accepted the invitation to sit at the table of tax collectors and of other sinners. He ate with people of all status and of all walks of life. He ate with people who were absolutely despised by their own community. And he ate with people who were held up with esteem and authority by their community. He ate with people who would call him a heretic, who would say he was a blasphemer, who would eventually ask for his head. He ate with people who would one day go to Pilate and say, "We want this man dead." And Jesus ate with them. They had completely different theological understandings, completely different thoughts about God and about how God operated and what God wanted and what God was willing to do and who God was, the characteristics and the nature of God. Jesus sat and ate with them. He wasn't afraid of what they had to say. And to their credit, they were able to eat with him as well. They were willing. They were willing to be there around the table. Yes, I know they were scheming and they were plotting and they were doing their thing, but they were willing to be there and they were willing to listen, just like him. We need to be willing to do the same. We need to be willing to listen to the opinions and the thoughts of others. I mean, we need to be willing to seek out the counsel. We need to be willing to seek out the counsel of people who see the world differently than ourselves. It's a sign not of weakness, and it's certainly not a sign of foolishness. It's a sign of strength, and it's a sign of wisdom. We need to be willing to sit at the table with all kinds of different people from all kinds of different places, who speak all kinds of different languages and who hold all kinds of different values. We don't have to be afraid of that. As a matter of fact, we need to embrace that. And we should see that. We should see the opportunity to have that as an incredible gift. And I'm really, really, really fascinated and thankful that Kamala Harris, the current vice president seeking election in the U.S. Presidential election on November 5th, I'm really excited that she is saying publicly, I want other voices around me. I want other voices than my own speaking into my leadership, speaking into my presidency, speaking into my life. That's a brave thing. It's a wise thing. And it's an incredibly strong thing for her to be willing to do. And we should be willing to follow suit, because that was kind of Jesus's position as well. Amen.